Hello and welcome to Back to Basics, a series of videos where I revisit and explore the most iconic technological innovations from Veeam and also reflect on the fundamentals that have contributed to Veeam's success for nearly 15 years. Today, we are going to talk about one of these technological innovations. It is a technological innovation that has completely transformed the traditional approach to restoration and was something very disruptive 15 years ago in the entire data protection industry. This technological innovation is instant recovery. Today, instant recovery exists in several forms. There is instant recovery for virtual machines, instant recovery for x86 physical machines, instant recovery for databases, and instant recovery for NAS. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about instant recovery for Microsoft SQL databases. Let's go. To address this topic a bit and talk about instant recovery for SQL databases, I think it's important to understand the concept, how it works, and what the specifics are of this type of instant recovery. Unlike the instant recovery of virtual machines and physical machines, we will try to understand a bit about the specific features of this instant recovery. So to start, on the diagram, on the whiteboard or the blackboard, you have here to essentially represent the entire SQL server. Basically, so on this SQL server, we have a SQL instance represented here, and on this SQL instance, we have a database that we will use to illustrate all of this and understand the concepts and the mechanism well. This database is accessed by a user who is located here and is working on it. Let's assume that this is the application, a business application of the company that stores information in this database. This SQL server is backed up by Veeam on this repository. Regularly, once a day, and in addition to this image backup, Veeam also backs up the transaction logs to allow for restoring the database to a very precise point in time and performing what is called PITR, point-in-time recovery, for example. So, if we consider a scenario of database unavailability, such as database corruption, and we represent it like this. What is the availability of this database? What options are available to the administrator? He has different restoration options and various possibilities for recovery. What interests us here, of course, is the most interesting restoration scenario in terms of RTO, the one that will minimize downtime and achieve the shortest possible RTO, which is instant recovery. This is the promise of instant recovery. It is about reducing downtime and shortening the restoration duration to achieve an RTO that is truly as short and minimized as possible. So, the principle of instant recovery, just like the instant recovery for physical and virtual machines, you may have already watched the video on the channel. The operating principle of instant recovery is Veeam's ability to start a number of workloads directly from the backup without performing a restoration initially. And so, this is really the foundation of instant recovery, the reversal of the restoration process. Instead of migrating, moving the data, extracting the data, moving it, and migrating it to storage and then starting, we do the opposite. We start by launching the workload, the VM, the physical machine, or the database, in this case, and then we will perform the data movement, the migration of the data from the backup to production in a second step in the background. Without interruption, or with minimal interruption. We will see that there are a number of differences at this level, but the principle remains the same. We start by booting directly from the backup. So, to illustrate all of this, the DB database is unavailable. The administrator triggers an instant recovery of the database. So what will happen is, at first, I will represent it here. We will have it like this. Starting right now, then immediately now.
So, we will begin the process directly from the backup copy of the repository, ensuring that all necessary data is intact and ready for use. So, we will execute it directly from the backup, and this first step is one that we call publish, the publication of the repository. So here we are going to write and publish the database in this tutorial, step by step, so that here is the published repository that contains all the necessary files. Published because the data files of the repository are stored on the Veeam repository, and it is from this repository that the database is attached to the SQL instance, allowing the database to function and be accessible. This is the first step. The second step is a step that I will represent here, which we will represent here like this. We have another instance, another repository here, which will actually be created at the end of the second step. This second step, which I will represent here, involves copying the data files and the repository. Additionally, this process includes several important sub-steps that ensure the integrity and accuracy of the data being copied. These sub-steps are crucial for the successful creation of the repository. There is a copy of the repository to the SQL server of the data files. Okay? Data file, log file. And so the database, this is what we call I will use the Veeam terminology, recovered database. Okay? So this is the second step. And of course, in the meantime, at the end of step 1, I forgot to represent it, but there is no longer any access, obviously here. At the end of the first step, the user is connected to this repository, connected to the published repository directly from the backup. So the first step is this, publishing the database. The user accesses their database that is running from the repository. So on the backup server, at the level of the mount server, there is a write cache where we will store all the modifications that will be made to this repository. All right? Therefore, the valid cache is stored here. Okay? So, step 1, step 2. Next, how are things going to be done? We are in a bit of an intermediate situation here. The third step is where I will represent it here. Obviously, I forgot to mention that we had this connection. It is essential for the published repository to be attached to the SQL instance. During the third step, what will happen is that we will represent it here as step 3. Here, this means that there will be a detachment, which means that at the end of the copy from step 2, the published repository here will be detached. The idea is how to ensure the transition from the published repository to the recovered database, moving from this state to the final state. This is the repository with files stored locally. How do we transition from this published state from the backup to this final state? There is an intermediate step, which allows for this switch, referred to as the switchover. We will detail the switchover shortly, but it is this switchover step that will first detach the published repository from the instance. Then, in the fourth step, here, I will represent it like this. We have a final synchronization between the published database and the restored database. So step 4 here, I'm going to call it final sync, or I will place it later to avoid overloading the whiteboard. Final synchronization. And then the last step is the step that will consist of attaching the recovered database, so restoring it, to the final instance. So this is the fifth and final step. So let's recap all of this. We will recap everything to make it much clearer. First step, here we will represent it. The first step is the publish. So the publication of the database.
So, this is a publish and the creation of the write cache. The write cache is created at this moment to allow for storing any modifications that have been made to the database. So, that is the publish. Next, the second step. We will present it here. The second step is the copy.db database files. Copy.db database files, at that moment something happens. That is to say, there is a copy of the database files. And then, what Veeam will do is evaluate the size of the write cache. And if we want to do if write cache is less than 100 millibaras, then we move on to step 3, at which point the switchover is triggered. The switchover is really designed to minimize downtime, keeping the interruption to a minimum. So if the write cache is less than 100 MB, the switchover is triggered automatically if we have chosen to be in automatic mode. We will see shortly in the demo that there are 3 modes. There is an automatic mode, a manual mode, and a scheduled mode. You can really set a specific time for triggering the switchover. There is always this check regardless of the switchover mode you select. Veeam will check and ensure, before performing the switchover, that the size of the read cache is less than 100 MHz. Once it is below 100 MHz, the switchover will be triggered. The goal is to ensure that this switchover operation is as short as possible. We ensure that the amount of data does not cause the final synchronization to take too long. The switchover, when it is triggered, moves us to step 3. In this step, I am going to set the value to 3, and then we will proceed to detach it. This action involves detaching the published database, which is a crucial part of the process. Next is step 4. Here is the final sync. A final synchronization is performed to ensure that the last modifications, those that are less than 100 megabytes, have been properly synchronized and replicated to the recovered DB, the restored database. So this step is the final play. And finally, there is a 4th step, which we will represent. It is somewhat intermediate, but there is a phase here that we will call 4 primes, which consists of dropping or deleting the published database. So here there is a drop. Publish DB, which is an important step in the overall procedure. And finally, the last step, step 5 in the diagram, is to attach and cover DB to complete, to explain the process in detail, to ensure everything is correctly set up. So if we need to summarize, the steps here from 3 to 5, it is the following. Switchover. That's what the switchover is. These are the detailed steps of the switchover. So the switchover is really designed to ensure that the interruption, the downtime, is as short as possible. To achieve this, we will make sure that the modification delta, that the cache is less than 100 MHz in size, in order to minimize the interruption and ensure a smooth transition back to the final state. Well, there you go. I hope it's a bit clearer with all these explanations. It took some time. I took the time to detail and explain. I hope this hasn't created too much confusion in your minds. What I propose now is to see in the interface how all of this comes together and how everything is configured. So, in the demo, we will work with this database to conduct the demo. So, this is a database for SharePoint. SharePoint config DB. Remember the name well. And what we are going to do is delete it. So, obviously, this database has been backed up. In any case, the SQL server or SQL instance here has been backed up by Veeam. So, what we are going to do is delete this database to simulate its unavailability. We are going to delete it, plain and simple. There you go. So, this database has been deleted. So, We are going to perform an instant restore, not a traditional restore, which would obviously take much longer for a database of several terabytes, for example. Therefore, we will do an instant restore. I come to Veeam here. I go into the job where I go into the backups of this SQL server, right-click. Restore application items, Microsoft SQL database. Here I choose the restore point. I take the latest one, next, browse. And there, I launch the restore utility, so Veeam Explorer for SQL Server. I find the database here, SharePoint config DB. I right-click, and there you see all the possible restore scenarios. Restore database, traditional restoration, the schema, the export of the backup, and what interests me here is the instant recovery, and I will perform an instant recovery to the last known good state, the last good backup, and I will start all of that. You see that the first thing it asks me is what switchover mode we want to implement, so I will intentionally choose manual. To truly visualize the steps in the logs, you have the auto, manual, and schedule modes. But in each of these types of switchover, there is always this control and verification of the cache size. If the cache exceeds 100 megabytes, Veeam performs a normal sync. It synchronizes and sends the changes to synchronize the database files. If the cache is less than 100 megabytes, at that point, all conditions are met for Veeam to perform its switchover. So we will do it in manual mode, recover. So we will follow the logs here. I am connecting, stand recovery, SharePoint config DB. So you see the first step, publishing database. So you see a bit of the diagram here. The publication was the first step. Next, the second step is copy DB files. So we can clearly see here the copy target files, the two steps that I described on the whiteboard earlier. So here, starting from, you see the database publication completed, the file copying, so step 2 continues to take place. And if I go back here to the SQL part, if I do a little refresh in SQL Studio, you can see that we find the database. It has reappeared, it is operational again. Currently, this database, the files are stored on the backup. And there, we can immediately access this database again. It is fully operational. If I come back here, you can see the file copy still in progress. So now, I return to the whiteboard. This is step 2 that is currently being done. We copy files from the database, log files, and data files from the repository to the SQL server, the target SQL server. And the file copy has just finished synchronization and it is ready for the switchover. This means that Veeam considers there is obviously very little activity on this database, so the write cache is less than 100 megabytes, and therefore Veeam is ready to perform the switchover. And since I requested a manual switchover, it's up to me to do it. If I had set the switchover to automatic mode, Veeam would have automatically triggered the switchover to complete the operation and finalize the restoration. So now I will perform the manual switchover, and we will follow what happens. You see synchronization. It has detached the database, and now it is in the process of attaching. Now I return to the whiteboard. We are at step 5 on the whiteboard. He is currently in the process of carefully attaching the recovered database and securely attaching the target database. And there you have it. The operation is complete, the restoration is finished, and we have our SharePoint config DB back, which is fully operational, usable, and completely restored. So in the interface, it is relatively simple, straightforward, and easy to configure, implement, and user-friendly. There is another way to use this feature, which is to quickly make a parallel database available. For example, if you need to run an SQL script, make queries, or test something, you can use this mechanism to have a sort of copy of the database that is started directly from the backup. The changes are stored in the cache, and then at the end, if you do not wish to keep this copy, this database, you can go back by canceling the operation and letting Veeam clean up. There you go. Well, I hope all of this has been clear enough for you, and that you have learned a lot about the instant recovery of SQL databases. We continue the series. I will continue the series to explore with you the recovery moment of Postgre, Oracle, and NAS databases. Coming soon. There you go. Thank you all. Goodbye.